If you are at the bleeding edge of classic gaming, then you've heard of MiSTer, the open source FPGA-based emulation platform based on the fundamental goal of hardware accuracy. MiSTer already has tons of cores spanning 8 to 32-bit consoles, home computers, arcade games, and more. In this series, I'll feature one FPGA core every day for the next 21 days to ring in the new year. Your MiSTer becomes a consolize Game Boy Advance, thanks to a core by German coder Robert Pipe. It was originally designed for the Jurassic DE2 FPGA dev board and called FPGA. Robert ported it to MiSTer himself, and it has been updated by Robert, Sorgelig, and the MiSTer team. This core is a major accomplishment because the Game Boy Advance is actually a relatively powerful 32-bit 6th generation console, significantly more powerful than a Super Nintendo, but just at a lower resolution. The core uses 26,000 logic elements on the FPGA, and Robert tested 1,600 games on the core after porting it to MiSTer. It comes with an open source BIOS by Normat, but I highly recommend replacing it with the real GBA BIOS. You can do that by renaming a BIOS ROM to boot0.rom and putting it in your Game Boy Advance ROM folder. And if you want a game to automatically load when it boots, rename it to boot1.rom. And unbelievably, the Game Boy Advance core requires no MiSTer add-ons like RAM or anything else. It'll run on the DE10 Nano alone. If you do have the MiSTer RAM add-on board though, enable SDRAM in the menu for the best performance, although that should be set automatically. This core isn't just a simple consolize Game Boy Advance, it's loaded with features that really do make this feel like a follow-up to the Super Nintendo, with a brand new, mostly 2D library of games that have that Super Nintendo look, but Game Boy Advance power behind them. I'll go through these features one by one to show you what it can do. Early Game Boy Advance games had their colors oversaturated to compensate for the first model GBA's washed-out display. That's fine if you're playing on an original GBA, but it looks bad on the GBA SP, or for us when we're playing with direct video capture. So MiSTer has an option to desaturate the video in 3 levels, 25, 50, and 75% reduction. I like a saturated look in my games, but the GBA just went too far. You can really see it in a game like Super Mario Bros. 3, where the colors just really bleed together because it's so oversaturated. I like level 1, but some people also like level 2. I think 3 is going too far. We used to get really excited when new no-glow hacks came out at romhacking.net for the Game Boy Advance, but only a few were ever released. Now you can have it for every single game, and it's configurable. This is going to be huge for GBA fans, because it's the first time you can really tailor those colors to your preference. Almost all of the early GBA games were affected by this oversaturation. Another great example is Wario Land 4, where the colors are just overblown. Set it to level 1 though, and everything's perfect to me. Of course, my favorite feature is the fact that this core can output RGB video if you have an I/O board or a direct video dongle. Playing the Game Boy Advance on a CRT is a completely new experience. It's just unbelievable. The games look fantastic. It's absolutely like a Super Nintendo. It's surprising just how good they look on a big TV considering that they were designed for such a small screen. But just look at this. And Yridian 2 is maybe even more impressive. With its 3D effects and lush colors, it just wasn't designed for a small screen. This has to be seen on the big screen to be appreciated. The core also has a CPU turbo option in the menu. This is not to be confused with overclocking, it simply shortens the time the CPUs need to execute operations. But it does mean that things are no longer cycle accurate once enabled. This killer option though completely transforms a game like Doom. Doom played well considering that it was on the Game Boy Advance, but the slowdown and lag is really noticeable if you've played it on a computer. Turn on the CPU turbo option though, and the slowdown is completely gone. It plays exactly like the Doom that you remember. And the GBA controller is actually perfect for it, surprisingly enough, with the left and right strafe buttons. Speaking of controllers, you can play this core with a real Super Nintendo controller, or with almost any USB controller you plug in. A Super Nintendo controller just feels perfect for the Game Boy Advance, but I've also been using the Xbox One controller since I really like its clicky 4-way D-pad for games like Dr. Mario. But for platformers, the Super Nintendo controller is where it's at. When you map your controller, you'll notice that there's an option for fast forward. This is really handy for RPGs where the text scrolls slowly and there's no way to skip it. Look how fast I can jump into Castlevania Aria of Sorrow with the fast forward option. The text in the Zelda games are really annoyingly slow too, and fast forward just speeds right through them. Here's a Link to the Past with the hair palette mod hack, which fixes Link's hair to look like the Super Nintendo version. The feature that people have been most excited for, though, are Sultan G42's video filters, which are there for every MiSTer core and really allow you to dial in the look that you want. For handhelds, it can do some really interesting things. As long as you have integer scaling enabled in your INI file, you'll be able to perfectly rescale every individual pixel to a perfect square with an outline around it. This gives a true LCD effect on a giant screen TV, and I have likened it to the look of stained glass mosaic. Seeing this on my 75-inch screen is otherworldly. In order to really see it though, make sure you're watching this video in 4K, otherwise YouTube is going to stretch out and blur the video strangely when it resizes the video. There are dozens of LCD effects to choose from, so I'll just show off a few of my favorites. Look how good Metroid Zero looks with this LCD filter. And here's an alternative one. Here's a sort of negative LCD filter where the border outline is white. It gives you a much brighter look and kind of more like an original Game Boy or something. I really like the effect in Mario Kart Super Circuit. In addition to these filters, you also have some really nice gamma options. And all of these filters and gamma profiles are pulled in automatically through the update script. So after you've run the update script once, you'll have all of these available in your MiSTer setup. And for all Game Boy Advance games, I recommend using Pure Gamma 125 or 130. There's also a handy sync core to video option in the menu. This is because a GBA would periodically lose sync outputting direct video. So this pauses the core briefly to maintain stable video. It works exactly like the de-jitter mods for the NES and Super Nintendo consoles. In theory, it slows down the core slightly when it happens, but in practice it's not noticeable, and it allows all of MiSTer's scalar VSync options to work. Here it is in Advance Wars, a series that I must have thousands of hours in. These are the game that I associate with the Game Boy Advance, and they've gone everywhere with me when I travel for almost 20 years now. So there's your look at the core that caused shockwaves when it was announced. It came out of nowhere from a lone coder and felt like Christmas when it dropped. And that's just another day in MiSTer World, where it seems like there's a new core every day lately, and they just keep getting bigger and better. Robert knocked this one out of the park and essentially gave me a sequel to one of my favorite consoles, the Super Nintendo. This is Super Nintendo 2.0. It's consolized and ready for any controller on the big screen. What core will be next in my countdown? Find out tomorrow in my next video. This video represents a snapshot of the core as it exists today, but by the time you're watching this in the future, it may have been improved or expanded with new features. Hit the subscribe button to be kept up to date with all the latest MiSTer happenings, and ring the bell to be notified when I go live for a stream. If you like the channel, consider supporting it. Patreon support at any level gets you an instant invite to the SmokeMonster Elite Discord and early access to my videos. Thank you so much for your support, I really appreciate it.